In Argentina or in France, if you go to a hospital or to a university, you will see 80%, 70% are psychoanalysts, Jungian, Freudian, Lacanians. The majority, I should say, are Lacanians. And they're Winnicottians, Kleinians. Many schools, mostly from psychoanalysis. While in America, in the States, Lacan is only known in cultural studies, critical literature, literary theory, gender studies. There is a program in Buffalo, New York University about literary theory. And I don't know if you know, but as far as I know, there is no one psychology schools in the United States that offer Lacan as a subject. Lacan training is outside the spectrum of university in the United States. I think the comparison of the model with the Freudian one will lead into a comparison with the model of the Freudian Lacanism that prevails in psychoanalysis today. I choose one of the most representative of these models. I will also compare the psychoanalysis by Lacan's son-in-law, Jacques-Alain Miller, who is the official publisher of his works. Lacan based the clinic in the concept of structure. Often he referred to the psychotic, neurotic, perverse, hysterical, obsessive structure. He used the same conceptual tool when he referred to the structures of the phantasm, the structure of desire, or the structure of the symptoms. Although I prefer the comments and I would love to engage in conversations at the end, if there is any term or something, I don't want a jargon to be a barrier between us. If there is something, a question is most welcome at any time for a technical commentary on a term. Well, this idea of a structure I was talking about, it was an attempt to establish intelligibility in psychoanalysis. In other words, when we talk about psychotic structure or a neurotic one, we are questioning ourselves which are the elements operating in the discourse of the analysant and under which logic. Lacan said, quotation, structures constitutes the practice named psychoanalysis. The concept of structures that operates in psychoanalysis was developed by Lacan, departing from Claude Lévi-Strauss' model of structures, among others. The main characteristic, to summarize briefly today, is that there is no other structure than the structure of language. If you are going to get out of something today, is that the structure of language is what determines us. Its elements, including gestures, events, feelings, are signifiers. We call signifiers within the clinic to all those elements. The unit, the signifier, is characterized by its condition or of relating to other signifier, either by opposition, negation, or differential capacity. There is no signifier that means anything except in relation to other signifier. In a psychoanalytic session, every murmur, silence, tone becomes a signifier in relationship with the question. Now, the signifier exists in a chain of signifiers, S1, S2, meaning signifier 1, signifier 2. this group of signifiers is considered a set and therefore is never a complete totality. Our relation with language is always in the sense of a lack. What defines the subjectivity will be the relationship to a universe of signifiers. In the same way that you can perhaps recognize Vivaldi music or a rap or any type of genre saying, oh, I recognize those signifiers. And let me just tell you, if nobody asked, but I will say, signifier is a term that Lacan borrowed from Ferdinand de Saussure, and the concept of signifier and signified. Signifier means the sound image of a word, and signified denotes the meaning we associate that word. Saussure show us how arbitrary was the nature of this relationship, and Lacan inverted. For Saussure was signified important and the signifier under. Lacan's invert the relationship, putting the signifier first and then the signified. The signifier exists in this chain of signifiers. Psychoanalysis is a practice that is interested in the dimensions of desire, symptom, enjoyment, or I should say more appropriate, for the lack of other word, jouissance. In psychoanalysis, we use the word jouissance. Sometimes it's referred to enjoyment or pleasure. However, there is a huge difference. For Lacan, the term has to do with jouissance is a complex way to denote a transgressive, excessive kind of pleasure, linking to the division and splitting of the subject involved. This jouissance that we experiment implies the necessary encounter with life in society, the biological dimension, and the cultural body. And this, therefore, the structure in Lacan is defined in three registers: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. It is precisely for this reason that it is meaningless to think Lacanian psychoanalysis as part of a structuralism movement, and to determine that since structuralism is outdated in social science, it would apply the same for psychoanalysis. Only psychoanalysis have access to the structure through the discourse organized by these three registers. This means that listening and reading of the discourse operates in the confluence of the signifier change in the legality of the registers. I define the registers on many of my lectures. You can refer them to YouTube or anywhere. Today I'm giving you a very compact, in order to make on time, a very compact definition of models. So if need further explanation, I'll be happy to, but be expecting the very compact version of each model. So I will say that imaginary is anything we can say and imagine that can be said. The real is what does not stop of not being written. I repeat, is what that does not stop of not being written. Could be considered the impossible, for example. And the symbolic is the register which has something forbidden in certain place. The three registers are established according to each chain of signifiers. In this case, each register will be read with different elements and relationship in each case. The concept of structure changed inevitably the conceptual elaboration and the practice of psychoanalysis. In the same way that Freud's concept of unconscious differed from any concept of unconscious before him, the same idea applies to the notion and use of the concept of a structure in Lacan. If you want, I can do a very quickly comparison between Freud and Lacan. A structure in Lacan is what psychic apparatus is in Freud. What for Lacan is the signifier, for Freud was the representation, either a word or affect. The internal law of the structure for Lacan is as a signifier as such means nothing. In Freud, the word was related to the resistance, according to the personal experience. The composition of elements, as I said, in Lacan, the signifier chain is also referred as the scene that you give an account. In Freud, you have the articulation alpha, then beta, and then the free association. Lacan registers are, as I said, symbolic, imaginary, and real. For Freud, he gave us the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious in his first topic, and later on his life he talked about the ego, superego, and id. A question that I have been asked many times, especially in Mexico, I don't know why. When I talk about language, which is a huge difference with any psychological school in Anglo-Saxon world, or with other schools like cognitive or any other psychological approaches, is the conception of language. And many ask me about Chomsky linguistics. According to Chomsky, the structure is established as universal grammar, the organ of language. In this sense, his theory is innate or has an innatism quality, versus Lacan's notion that language is a dimension that was always present. Language is there even before we are born. Chomsky's theory has these primitive elements with a specific value. For him, and for many authors, specifically of the cognitive psychology, they see a structure as like a building with regions, a localization of levels. But for Lacan, the concept of language is a universe where there is an ultimate differential element. For example, you can see a patient saying, you know, my mother is my mother. And you can agree with me that the signifier mother has a totally different meaning from the first time to the second. Lacan's conception of language implies that there is no possibility of meta-language. In Chomsky's theory, it's a complete one, despite that both coincide in the fact that it's possible to construct an infinite sentence. Do you know the joke that Steven Pinker, so a famous psychologist, cognitive psychologist, he said that there is a phrase in English language, I think it's a poem or a novel, that has 1,200 words. It appears in Guinness as the longest phrase. And in language, we have always the capacity to expand always language. Pinker says, the example being funny, he can say, as Pinker says that, and then put that whole sentence, and somebody else will come and say, the stupid of Pinker said that Pinker said, blah, 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 blah. So a sentence could be infinite. So here what matters is the concept of a structure. If the structure is a map, we talk about individuals. like in other schools. Even in psychoanalysis, some people talk about it that way, but Lacan's notion of subject is an original and distinctive one. In Lacan's clinic, A is not equal to A. As I said before, mother and mother. The idea of identity is imaginary. And I have to present this study departing from Lacan and Freud because they are the reference for many, many psychoanalysts today. One of the questions to determine which is the subject or theme of psychoanalysis in this century beyond the case-by-case logic. Do you know that psychoanalysis is one of the very few, maybe the only one, discipline with scientific basis, at least on Lacan's account, in Western civilization, whose practice is strictly particular. Each case is new and unique. Lacan said, yes, the question is to know that psychoanalytic discourse could allow a little more, namely, to introduce that the unconscious does, to introduce what the unconscious doesn't do at all, a little calculation. What is at stake here is some little calculation about the symptoms. And following that logic, the clinical types, as Lacan referred to. These types respond to the structure. Even more, we can affirm that every period of time has a limited number of clinical types. Think about the hysterical woman before the Freud time, and how was the conceptual approach to hysteria after Freud concept of the unconscious. However, the particular elements that take place in each case, even though they participate of the configuration of a clinical type, they only acquire meaning within the intrinsic logic of each subject. Well, one of the most fundamental, crucial effects of the structure is the subject himself. The subject is an effect, an outcome of the fact that we are speaking beings. I rephrase. The subject is in effect the outcome that we are speaking beings. I am going to compare in a very brief manner 4 models, if I have the time, with you tonight. Rosalinda, would be so kind to put the first slide?
Yes.
Thank you. Can everybody see it?
Yes, they should be able to see it now.
Sure. It will be the second slide, I mean, the one coming after. I put every school just to make a very compact comparison between 3 categories: anthropological universals, time coordinates, and the direction of the cure, the end of analysis. For Freud, the anthropological universals refers to those considerations without limit of space and time. I mean, for him, they would apply to the whole world and would be applicable in the past and the future. We consider in his theory the origin as the murder of the father. With Freud's theory, we can have the impact, the confrontation of biology and culture. I can reference, for example, civilization and its discontent, to name an example. The biological aspect is represented by the drives, and regarding the culture, the Oedipus. This impact, drives, versus the Oedipus complex would be the scenario of the civilization and its discontent. There are 3 terms for Freud: man, woman, father. And he coherent with his scenario, we have the ego representing the individual with the drives of life and death, The id would be the representation of the drives, and the superego would be the moral of the civilization. Regarding the time coordinates, in a very succinct presentation, I refer you to The Psychology of Masses. It's a book in which Freud, following Le Bon, presents the identification with the masses as a factor of individualism. To be specific, for Freud, individualism was something good, in the sense that it was not just the evolution of the biological body, but a healthy and harmonious maturation articulated with the principles of Western society, European middle class of the 19th century. This maturation implies that the man becomes an effective father and a woman an appropriate mother. The psychosexual maturation implies then that the man will be taking care of the reproduction, continuing the chain of the father, separating the child from the mother, which alleviates the anguish of castration, the concept of penis envy, and the maturation of the Oedipus, etc. Could you please, Rosalinda, go to slide number 3, Jacques Lacan. In Lacan, the anthropological universals would be the structure, the chain of signifiers. Also a creation of his, which was the object petit a, if you want object petit a. He wanted to do not be translated, to keep it as an algebraic structure. This is a rest. Somebody called the object A the cause of desire. It's a lack inherent in the structure of language and the unconscious structure like a language. The S1 and S2, the signifiers, the metonymic combination articulated to the metaphor of the subject, this can also be presented as alienation and separation. From the concept of alienation derives the notion of lack of being, in a system of a loop, as a metaphor of the subject, and separation as the notion of a creative spark. You know, when it's a game, when the child separates from the mother, conceived as the advent of a new subject. For Lacan, we are not biological machines. This means that our doing is not the result of internal biological drive. The drive for Lacan is the echo in the body of the fact that there is a discourse. Jouissance is an effect of the signifier. That doesn't require flesh or bone, nor instinct or domesticated instinct. It doesn't come from the inner self or our biological body. I mentioned that in addition to this, he presented to these 3 registers, and the symbolic conceived as a whole, as there is always something forbidden. The imaginary as consistence. Lacan considered the body, our body, as imaginary, and the real as existence. I hope to have the time to expand later at the end, but I will keep going for now on these concepts. Regarding the time coordinates, we have the subject of science, the 17th century, which is the century of the lights, the 4 discourses, and the disciplines that Lacan emphasized for psychoanalysis to know, namely logic, mathematics, linguistics, anti-philosophy, and theoretical physics. Rosalinda, are we on time? Until what time do we have exactly?
Let me just double check here. Oops.
Do we have a little more than half an hour?
Yeah, we have a little time here. Let me just double check.
Sure, sure. So, 4 o'clock, so we have almost an hour, right?
Yes.
Oh, excellent.
Yes.
Ex- Excellent, excellent. So, in addition to this concept, he presents these concepts that I mentioned before. However, the dimension of the real could be considered not as universal, but as a time period articulated concept. For example, it could be considered as the mathematical, logical impossible at certain period. And in other culture, in other epoch, the real could represent another dimension of existence. Regarding the time coordinates, as I said, we have the subject of science. And I would like to read to you that according to Lacan, the subject of science is, Lacan argued that the psychoanalysis is not based on any appeal to an ineffable experience or flash of intuition, but on a process of a reasoned dialogue, even when reason confronts its limit in madness. With regards to the end of analysis, is the articulation between the unknown knowledge, the unconscious, and the operation with the subject supposed to know. I don't know if anybody of you came to my last presentation. My last presentation was dedicated to distinguish between the concept of transference in Freud versus the subject supposed to know in Lacan. Just for curiosity, did anybody came to that lecture? Oh, you don't have to say it if you don't want to. So it was the previous one which divert again Lacan and Freud on those issues, on the issue of the transference. Today I add a small new concept, which is these two concepts are operating, and I mentioned the two concepts, no, I didn't mention, let me repeat. The two concepts would be the subject supposed to know, the analyst, the position of the analyst, with the unknown knowledge, which is a way we can mention the unconscious. Work operates point by point in the journey of how Lacan describes the subject in the figure of the Moebius knot. As you know, for Freud, the human psyche was the shape of an egg, if you remember, with all the areas, superego, id, and the conscious, and there was an inner and outside world. For Lacan, when he presents this notion, he is an extremely original conception that analysis and the discourse, it's not in the shape of an egg, but actually on the structure of a Moebian knot. Can you see here? The detour of an analysis would be the detour over this figure, this topological figure, which, by the way, has two dimensions. And the idea is that the symptoms, the truth, the ultimate truth of our subjectivity is on the universe of the dimension of the discourse, which for Lacan is two-dimensional. Through the cat, the interpretation, the intervention comes as the act of creation of a new subject. This entails the operation with the unknown knowledge and the fall, as I described in my last lecture, the fall of the subject supposed to know. I add this time the process that Lacan refers as the crossing of the phantasm. I will try to define for you. The phantasm, in Lacan theory, the term fundamental phantasm take on the characteristics not of a figure, but a literary script describing a scene where the subject comes to occupy a place determined by the desire of the other. What we call our desire is you're always in mixture with this other. Somebody could perhaps ask, what is this other? Well, the first other that we confront is this transcendent alterity, the radical alterity, the big other, which Lacan used the letter A for autre, which is the other, and this equates with language and law, and hence the big other is inscribed in the order of the symbolic. To give you a close, very brief description, you can associate the other, the big other, to the battery of signifiers or language as a whole, but with a bar, in the sense that we don't have access to the complete. We always work in a set. So, to describe briefly the phantasm is to be able to see in each case that we exist in a universe of signifiers. Therefore, we exist in a universe which is abstract. The act of crossing the phantasm should not be interpreted as crossing to the terrain of fantasy to reality, illusion to real, or to be a neurotic, to be an analyst. No. Instead, is to realize that we live and elaborate our subjective truth in a world of signifiers. Rosalinda, would you be so kind to move to the slide number 3 or 4? I think 3. No, 4. Yes, Jacques Alain Miller. No, please, the other one. Thank you, that one. Yes. Did you know that Jacques Alain Miller is the publisher of Lacan's works? And there is a lot of controversial regarding the order that he published them and some alterations on the text, as much as writing his own version in the famous Lacan book of Écrits, writings. The first edition, Lacan refers to a continuous dialogue with science, and that comment was altered by Jacques Alain Miller when the edition comes with some comments about totally different version of Lacan's account. And I will present Miller as one of the highest regarded psychoanalysts. He's an author, researcher, and the official publisher of Lacan works. He was trained in philosophy and in psychoanalysis with Lacan. With him, we can also associate the tendency of this Freudian Lacanian continuum that seems to prevail on the psychoanalytic world. We refer to him to compare the coincidences and disagreements with his theory. To understand his assessment, it is important to be familiarized with anthropologists, sociologists, and authors of the postmodern world. Now, what is presented in the contemporary psychoanalysis by Miller and other psychoanalysts as anthropological universals, as you have written there, is namely, 1, that there is no other; 2, that the jouissance is a singular and deadly. You know, for the jouissance, remember that Freud describes the drives as the drive for life and the drive for death, eros and thanatos. Miller said that jouissance is the drive of life and death together. Freud 1 plus 2. Three, the relevance to establish a being of jouissance as the main characteristic of the subject. 4, that we live in a world without sense, without meaning. 5, the notion that the real is our body. This, the one that we can touch. 5, the idea or the consideration that the time to be considered in psychoanalysis is the present. And finally, to keep on mind that in this frame, in this epistemological view, involves to accept the notion of subjective responsibility. This is a huge discussion in today's world, subjective responsibility. You know, when we talk about the citizen, if we talk about the law and somebody stealing something, of course, there is a responsibility and there is consequences for any act. But when we talk about the subject of the unconscious, at least on the psychoanalysis that I am trained, which differs from Miller, there is no subjective responsibility because of the fact that there is the dimension of the unconscious. How can you be responsible for a symptom under which you have no control? It's a contradiction with the logic of the unconscious. One point I would like to make is that the most lucid authors from a variety of disciplines, sociology, philosophy, anthropology, linguistics, I mention a few only. Baudrillard, Tassic, which is a mathematic. He has a great book on mathematics and postmodern world. Lyotard, and perhaps I should mention one that I discovered through my studies, and I found a fascinating one to which I can recommend his readings to understand about current postmodernism, is Gilles Lipovsky. Gilles Lipovsky is a French author and has worked with the concept of Lacan of desire. It's very interesting that many postmodern authors works with the Lacanian notions, but never mention Lacan, or very rarely mention Lacan. So here it's relevant to distinguish between postmodernism as a way of life and the sociocultural demands of our times versus postmodernity as a position that is representative of how in the postmodernity the subject assumes a position as valid because of its rejection to the modernity or the values of the modern world. The element of postmodernism as time coordinates in the theory of Miller and many Freudian Lacanians is a position anti-cogitative, anti-thinking, a rejection of the century of the light. This entails that the access to the drives is only through the experience, and thinking is depreciated as a neurotic feature. We are biological machines, according to Miller, guided by our drives. This would be the description of an experience of analysis, an experience of jouissance, or a traumatic one. The logic consequence of this is a return to the past, a praxis pre-scientific, and a father pre-modern, I would call it. I think that the father of the law, the one that put the limits to the child as the only one, is a pre-modern conception of the father. Perhaps we can consider, through gender and cultural studies, that we are redefining in our society what does it mean to be a father, a mother, a family, a son, a daughter. Another problem of this approach is that the movement, in clear difference with other disciplines, for example, cognitive theory, in cognitive theory they are always striving to try to contribute new approaches and new scientific discoveries. Psychoanalysis has an heuristic that is something that I critique in this presentation and in my presentation, which is always the return to the past, and therefore negating the updating of the conceptual apparatus. Furthermore, by separating from a cogitative thinking approach and the inclusion of knowledge of other science, we end up attacking or rejecting knowledge. As a result, we are only left with a hyper appreciation of the experience. You know, those psychoanalysis says, oh yeah, it's only that moment, the ineffable. And it becomes more like a mythical or pre-scientific notion of psychoanalysis. Other aspect and consequences of this approach are the binary sexuality, which is coincidental with the notion of a pre-modern father. The direction of the cure is considered as the symptoms of the postmodernity as universals. As I described above, to limit jouissance, understood as coming from the interior of my body, as the ultimate truth. In this way, the end of analysis is a cynical one. Since the suffering comes from civilization, the reaction should be to reject the discourse of science, to operate with humor, irony, and pun or war games, which are values of the cynical philosophy. According to this approach, science and its effects of massification does not allow us to be in touch with our singularity, unique and specific one. I'd like to read something about that to you. This is the concept of singularity and that there is no other in Miller's account. In a Congress of Psychoanalysis and Psychology of 2017, there was a psychoanalyst, Enrique Prego, who said that, talking about Miller and the singularity, he stated, in this sense, the interpretation should surely point to the foundation, saying that underlies the current discursive form that tried to impose its hegemony over the others. In particular, when the speech postmodern master radically exclude any relation to the unconscious, the politics of psychoanalysis should aim more beyond good reasons and intentions from an ethic that has the act as a principle. In this sense, it's not a question of departing from the father, but from the unconscious as what is yet to be defined, in the time of no other, or when the other does not exist. Politics takes the shape from the symptom understood as an event of the body, since the letter of the symptom offers us the answer to the without compass subject of the time. This was presented in a Congress of Psychology and is describing one of the principal points of Miller's approach to psychoanalysis today. So, because of these principles, Miller theory cannot become a school, because the transmission of knowledge is depreciated, or the resource to the experience as the only source of insight, and come back to explanation of our biological body, diminish the capacity of psychoanalysis to be considered a science in this epistemological view. Remember I told you about the signifiers that they come in a change, like S1, S2, and then S3 and S4, and it will be linked by a chain? For example, a stupid joke. The patient can come and say S1 and S2. I end up the relationship, and if you go too fast and says, oh, you separate, she was a bitch, pardon me the expression, and then he continued, no, I separate from my partner, my business partner, and you say, oops, mistake. The conceptual apparatus for the chain of signifiers always has 4 elements, and signifier might means a whole phrase, a whole description. In today's presentation, I am using actually S1, S2, Freud, Lacan, and I will present Miller and another version just to finish my presentation today, and perhaps engage with some comments, questions, or critics, or any insights. And as an S4, let's say, in this metaphor of discourse, I will present a school of psychoanalysis represented by one Argentinian psychoanalyst, which is Dr. Alfred Einderstein. Rosalinda, would you be so kind to please put the slide, that the next one? It would be Alfred Einderstein. Thank you. In this scheme, in this view, the universal truth for all time and space, we have S1 and S2 as the metaphor of the subject, as double loop, as Lacan had established. Articulated with this, a scientific articulation with a theory, a hypothesis, namely the Big Bang of language. This is an idea, it's not an event, Dr. Einderstein said. You know that it has a a consensual acceptance among the cosmologists and scientific community and research done until now, that about 13,500,000 years ago, appears a cut in the series of causal relationships, meaning that what happened before the Big Bang lose capacity to explain what happened afterwards. As an analogy, this idea is used for the universe of signifiers. We cannot claim elements or circumstances that has causality. We basically refer against the Freudian Millerian notion of the biological body, the res extensa, as the beginning. Nothing escapes the historical, social, and linguistic context. We are not negating the biological dimension. In the times of COVID-19, it's not about that. What we are saying is that to understand the subject of psychoanalysis, I repeat, nothing escapes the historical, social, and linguistic context. We are within a linguistic context even before we are born. With this question at the beginning, let me just make a commentary of this. In psychoanalysis, we have these two positions that has been always been fighting to each other. The problem of the origin, because Freudian is evolutionary and Lacan is a creationist. The difference is expressed both at the level of consideration of the particular case and society in general. The evolutionist approach starts from the postulation of a beginning from something that is substantial, tangible, which finally evolves and develops to maturity, to that particular a biological body, even if it is unicellular. Instead, for Lacan, the creation is ex nihilo, from nothing, and rejects the idea of evolution and maturation. This idea of Freud of psychosexual maturation, for Lacan, we are all messed up with all the stages circulating all the time. Freud's position is perhaps well known for you. I don't need to bring arguments, but regarding Lacan's, is the one that needs to be recovered and substantiated. From the beginning to the end of his teaching, Lacan always supports the creationist argument, deployed, for example, under some articulations that I will say to you. The symbol is already operating from the beginning, Lacan said, Seminar 2. The other is in place in the system of the world. It's already in place. Let me repeat. The other is already in place in the system of the world. Seminar 3. Meaning is always at stake in what is up to the subject. Remembering the no meaning world of Miller. In the Seminar 3, class 15, Lacan says, the other who is always in us. Just to show that every psychoanalyst has the right to create their own conception, but Lacan's statements are quite clear. And regarding the question of the origin, Lacan postulates the notion of a beginning that is ex nihilo. In the signifier order is the cause of the subject, and this is not the biological individual affected by language, in the sense of having made substantial raw materials before as our biological body, but rather it's created. It exists from nothing, with the fact, for example, that a signifier means nothing. If I say one word to you, blue, it means nothing only if I refer to other signifiers, acquire meaning. There is always in Lacan allusions to mathematics and special topology. He refers to the empty interval between signifiers, the holes of the Borromean knot originated on the signifier loop. Those are levels of topological conceptions to give an account of how the origin of the subject is the signifier. Also the concept of time, but I will keep giving, continue with the paper and finish before I come back to that. Regarding the end of analysis, the idea is that psychoanalysis deals with the suffering of postmodern times but in the modality of the case by case. This is a difference with other disciplines, such as anthropology, history, physics, linguistics, and even with social movements, such as feminism or cultural studies. The proposal is to address the suffering caused by the postmodernity within the context of a case-by-case logic, but based on clinical structures. This means that opposed to the postmodern individualism that could name personalization, this idea that I have to be me, each one of us must encounter the hidden persona in the interior of our biological body. I present a clinic of immixtion of otherness with the language, the A bar, with the other, big other, which is the incarnation of that. Every one of us has an incarnation of the big other. Let's say, for example, if we go to the prototype of genius, we go to, well, Einstein. I don't know, you have another. But again, we don't see the fault on or the lack on the other as neurotics. But the relationship is, the immixtion is with the language, or the A bar, with the other with capital O, and the other with small o, which Lacan refers our neighbor. As subjects, the existence we propose is exclusively in immixtion of otherness in these three modalities, with the A bar, with the other with capital O, and the other with a small o. The claim that these are the true coordinates of our existence may alleviate the suffering that produce the unstoppable demand of personalization. It could be expressed such as like saying each one of us must encounter its true self, to identify with it and make peace with what we don't like about ourselves. That's the position of a very famous psychoanalyst, student of Lacan, Colette Soler, and make it exist, this, in our system of relationships. Regarding the process of reification, which I say that to explain everything in biological terms, the rejection of science or the light, the idea is that the remedy to it is to articulate the condition of the subject. The lack of being of the signifier articulated with the creative spark, the universe of the signifier. The understanding that this universe is abstract, theoretical, conjectural, unsubstantial, anti-ontological, and bidimensional. I will refer to the concept of non-being. The lack of being. Lacan wrote, "The being of language is the non-being of objects. Being is only a lack of being, and the thing that could feel this lack is forbidden. This prohibition maintains desire. Thus, desire appears as the metonymy of a lack of being whose signifier is the phallus that marks what the mother lacks." And for Lacan, please, the phallus, before the feminists come over and start the debate, is a signifier. The lack and the fall of the phallus is regardless of the biological gender. It happens to the structure of men and women. So, under this frame, I was saying that the understanding that this universe, I repeat what I said, this universe I described in Lacanian terms is theoretical, conjectural, unsubstantial, anti-ontological, and bidimensional. regarding the nihilism or the no sense or life has no meaning, the idea is that to remedy is to apply the formula that Lacan created, which is that to the state of our individualism and no sense of life due to the fall of the meta-narratives, there is a rest, something that remains, something that still allows to the possibility for the creation of value. The petit object A, the petit object A, in French. This object A articulates the immixtion of otherness and the logic of case by case. The creation of value that exists as condition of possibility. It's a possibility, the creation of value. Life can mean art for somebody, music, or a family, tennis. There is meaning to life, the one that we create. And just to end tonight, I wanted to emphasize that many approaches to the praxis of psychoanalysis offer to deal with the human suffering, for example, Miller or Miller-Lacanians, American ego psychoanalyst approach is the hypermodernism. This term is from Lipovsky, the author I presented to you. He said about 1990 there was no more hypermodern times. It was how do you say the modern he created the term hypermodernism, and Miller used that term. In this notion, Miller proposes that there is no more than present time, there is no more utopias, the end of analysis is a cynical one. There is only singular jouissance from the biological body. And they propose as the solution to the cause of suffering the same conditions of the cause of suffering, namely a postmodern normative. The idea suggests as an alternative is to work in a new modality of the concept of desire. For example, we know that the subject of the postmodernism is obligated to choose ad infinitum. We have to choose a vocation, a job, a profession. We have to choose our playlist to go alone in the subway listening to our music. The problem of the postmodern subject, one of the problems, I'm just trying to give you a very solid and concrete mode of analysis over a few items. But one of the problems is not too much jouissance, but to follow the command, you must choose, and you must choose now. Whatever you think you like, whatever you think you are, you must do it. You must choose now. The idea of identity, there were some problems with some tennis players or older people playing at the very high temperatures, some of them dying. And I wonder sometimes we can link the concept of ideal with what you should be, what you identify as, the role that you play in society with a certain suffering. The clinic then is how to articulate these new demands with an ethic that Lacan defends in a way no other school have done, the ethics of desire. As Lacan said, and I finish with this, the only thing you can be guilty of is having given in your desire. Thank you for listening to me, and before I finish and we, if you like, engage on some conversation, I would like to tell you that I receive many questions about my work, and also as a cellist I perform around concerts. So Rosalinda, would you please be so kind to give my information? I give you my email For questions, my website, you are welcome to visit. My YouTube channel, so if in this postmodern, hypermodern, according to Lipovsky times, if you desire to choose to subscribe, I would much appreciate it. And I am also as Marcelo Zigaran in Facebook and Instagram. So you have ways to reach my lectures, my endeavors in music and psychoanalysis, and theoretical psychoanalysis and clinic, as I do. Once again, thank you for listening to me, and I welcome any comment, question that you might have. You can do a screen capture to have all my information, if you desire so. Rosalind, I don't know, if you would like to establish the camera and perhaps somebody would like to talk, we can do so in a more natural way, face to face.
Yes.
If I can clarify any concepts. I remember a session with you, Rosalind. Somebody saying in the comments, I follow you for half a session. I didn't understand a word you said. And after that, things start making sense about this structure, about how Lacan conceived. So I was wondering if somebody would like a clarification of a notion or a comment or something that could perhaps be of interest. For example, I brought notes on one particular notion, jouissance, which is a very complicated one, and I could comment, or we can leave that for next time if a dialogue is engaged. That would be much better for this time, I think.
I have a quick question.
Please.
I'm not. So I took a note here, something that sparked my mind. Maybe you could just expound upon it. Is the idea of the big other is language as a whole? I may be paraphrasing that incorrectly, but is that something that you can maybe retouch on?
Yes. You see, we have two questions here. The other is like a letter A for Lacan from autre, consider that radical alterity that language presents to us, it's something that we have to deal. And this is one of the things that other schools actually ignore, which is the barrier, the problems that language brings itself. Language alienates us, and we become a subject out of language. However, there is the other with capital O, which is the incarnation. I mentioned, for example, if you make a prototype of a genius, you say, oh, Einstein, for example, could be the big other, even though he probably doesn't know about many other subjects on life. And when we were children, the big other could be those who took care of us, and we didn't see any lack on them. We consider them the child, for example. It takes time until he realizes that the mother lacks the phallus, and makes equation, and we create our lives in society with this notion of lacks that, of course, applies to the father. We all encounter the lack in the other. Most of us encounter on that, and we still, however, need to refer to the need to have a big other in the sense of a reference. somebody who can be, for example, for many psychoanalysts, Freud is the big other. He's never wrong. or Lacan is the big other, when actually everyone goes through what we can call generically castration, in the sense of being the subject of a lack. Would that give like an answer to the question, or did it make it more obscure?
Oh no, I mean, I'm sure there's always more to be expounded upon. Your example of Einstein as a big other, in a sense, is really helpful.
As a prototype of knowledge, let's say in the level of science, we have the image of the big other. Who can be the big other? This guy know everything, even though he didn't. The same could be applied to other dimensions of other in our lives. We do have in our life a particular subjective other to which we refer to always. And it's part of the equation of an analysis to determine who is the other for the patient, for the analysand.
That's worth thinking about a lot more. Thanks, Marcelo.
Sure. Very welcome.
What is transgressive about jouissance?
The transgressive about jouissance is the fact that jouissance is a French word that sometimes is translated as enjoyment, but it has almost a connotation not only of pleasure, enjoyment, but also a sexual orgasm. And the jouissance concept it took more the latter context in psychoanalysis, and the idea was that there is a difference between pleasure, in which, for example, Freud said that we are trying to look for homeostasis. Pleasure is when we are at a level of homeostasis. There is no imbalance. We are without a lack of equilibrium. But jouissance is when produce this dimension of level that can be reaching an almost intolerable level of excitation. For example, Lacan says that the law of homeostasis that Freud evoked in Beyond the Pleasure Principles is the pleasure, while the function of enjoyment is to enjoy as little as possible. But jouissance is the transgression to the law. And this sense of jouissance always find a way to transcend the pleasure that is allowed in a society. We are always finding a concept, this idea of jouissance is always a sense of a transgression of the pleasure. It's a go beyond the principle of pleasure, and can create, according to the structure, the subjective structure can create a lot of suffering, and at the same time that enjoyment. You can use jouissance perhaps for the inspiration of a musician creating, but also for a psychotic symptom. Would this be would you like an expansion of that, or this satisfies? Thank you for the question. Today, the idea is for Miller is that we have excessive jouissance. This idea, and against that, I propose that psychoanalysis should not focus on limit the jouissance, saying, oh, there is an excess of jouissance, let's limit jouissance, because we don't follow. We have to understand the logic of a society in which there are more variables to consider than jouissance. For example, for Lipovsky, we have to consider the hyper-consumerism as a way that we become subject of a demand that is not ours. And this level expands on other dimensions. So jouissance is one of them, but we have to establish a logic to address the suffering of what we consider the post-modern or hyper-modern world, as you wish to call it.
Would they say that racial inequality would be another consideration? That it's not that it makes everybody suffer?
Racial inequality, of course, creates a lot of suffering, but it's not. It's based on a matter of construction of principles, that there is a superiority of a race, that there is something that considers something inferior. It has to do with an imaginary construction of the world. For Lacan, that's why I talk about anti-philosophy. For Lacan, the notions that we create to construct the world and under which we suffer the racial, for example, racial discrimination, the problems with women, the inequality in different aspects of social lives, are the creation of a discourse that is defined by imaginary. For Lacan, the common sense is the expression of the imaginary. This is not very well understood in America, which is so pragmatic. We consider in America, as I am American too, by naturalization, we said what works, that's real. But for Lacan, the real is an impossible